Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. My name is Alex Cabral, and this is my colleague, Doug Ryan. We're on the Innovative Finance and Policy teams at Grounded Solutions Network. Grounded Solutions Network is a national nonprofit focused on scaling housing with lasting affordability. Now, when I say housing with lasting affordability, I'm referring to models such as community land trusts, limited equity cooperatives, resident-owned communities, deed-restricted housing, the list goes on. These models generally are under the umbrella term shared equity housing, which is an affordable housing model that balances the benefits of individual ownership with community benefit. They do this through a legal structure that ensures affordability in perpetuity and wealth building opportunities. Today, we're going to let you all in on what we've been working on recently, which is how nonprofits can leverage infrastructure from the institutional investor sector in order to create affordable homeownership opportunities. And as we're getting to it, I'll just make a note that we're going to be using the terms private equity and institutional investor or investment interchangeably throughout the presentation.
Great, thanks, Alex. So as Alex mentioned, we are here to talk about the intersection between private equity and the nonprofit sector and how we are working together or how we can work together. And we wanted to start off with this slide to suggest and ask why we should care about this sector. Of course, the private equity space has gotten a lot of attention lately for good reason. In certain markets, more so than others, it has been taking up a lot of literally the real estate in the single-family rental market. And as this slide points out, this is from HUD, institutional investors can outbid individual home buyers, more so than ever before in individual transactions because of the cost of housing, mortgage rates, access to financing, and of course the amount of capital that these entities have. So it's really important that we understand who they are, and this slide talks about that they're large corporate investors. They're really kind of agnostic to the sector that they're in. They're looking for returns, and that's how the market works. So they're not necessarily going to be in this game for the long term, and that's something we want to help address over the next half an hour or so. So single-family rental investors and residential stability. I think this is a really important idea to think about. Now, these data that are on the slide are from two different studies, one about Las Vegas, the Las Vegas area, and the other one about Atlanta. That chart that's on the screen shows you the large institutional investors on top, and the ones on the bottom are the kind of small investors, your mom and pops. And this is talking about residential stability. That's something that we really care about, and what we're really talking about is evictions. So in essence, large SFR and institutional investors are more likely to evict families than smaller investors, mom and pops, or obviously nonprofits. So that's something that's really important. We are all about long-term affordability, and long-term affordability also means residential stability. So for example, Invitation Homes in Las Vegas is 290 times, that's correct, 290 times more likely to evict a family than a small landlord. That is remarkable. And there's the citation, you can take a look, it's from a couple of years ago. And then down in Atlanta, a researcher found that non-serial eviction rates are associated with more recent purchases. Non-serial simply means they actually want the family out. They are moving to evict, not just to prod rent payments. So this is really important. Again, this can cause residential instability in the neighborhood, and that's important to us because that impacts somebody's ability to become a homeowner, which is the game that we are in. We are interested in home ownership and affordable home ownership. Home ownership and race, I think we know the data that are on these, that's on this slide, these two different graphs. You can see that this goes back to 1976. By race, it's fairly consistent. We often hear the statement that black families have about the same home ownership rate as they did prior to the Fair Housing Act in 1968. It's probably even a little worse now than it was in 1968. The data are a little imperfect, but the graph shows you where we are. And we are committed at Grounded Solutions to try to move this needle and try to make some improvement here, because on the other side of the graph, you can see the wealth building potential and how that is tied to home ownership, and that is so very important.
Doug has set us up nicely, providing some background on how we currently view the current institutional investment sector, and a reminder that current approaches often perpetuate the existing racial wealth gap. Now, for the rest of the presentation, I'm going to ask you all to think outside of the box a bit and separate the actors from the tools which they use to achieve their stated goals, which are profit, as Doug has mentioned, and how we can use these tools for mission, as what we're all focused on. So what else do we know about private equity? Private equity plays various roles in the single-family housing market. They can acquire and rehab existing properties. They can partner to build and purchase built-to-rent homes. They may operate their own asset management and property management arms, and they handle disposition, preparation, and sale of assets. They also have fast, nimble, and often more risk-tolerant funding than what the nonprofit sector is accustomed to working with. We're often accustomed to working with public or philanthropic funds, which are often restrictive and bureaucratic. What's more, single-family rental and private equity funding often operates at a certain volume or transaction level that reaches cost efficiencies. For example, a lot of private equity actors access bond financing for their transactions, which often comes in at a lower interest rate than even CDFIs can offer. This level of volume is important to note and important for their operations in comparison to the nonprofit funding, which is often deal-by-deal transactions. Last but not least, private equity actors have built efficient operations for quick decision-making and scale. Imagine if a nonprofit had detailed, up-to-date data available in-house through data infrastructure and analytics that allowed them to make quick decisions for acquisitions and rehabs. Imagine if nonprofits had a standard process and infrastructure for rehab, repair, and property management through reliable third-party vendors and service providers. And imagine that rehab scopes were so rigidly standardized that appliances, fixtures, and finishes drove discounts and reduced turnaround times. The combination of flexible capital and data-informed decision-making is what makes private equity first movers and early purchasers in the market, often outbidding mom-and-pop landlords, your average home buyer, and local families. Their low operating costs give them an enduring advantage in the market, allowing them to achieve target returns and continue to scale. As we can see from this Redfin data here on the screen, over the past 20 years, the market share of home sales purchased by institutional investors has increased across all price points, low, mid, and high, but most notably lower priced homes, which is this top orange line you see here in the graph. What does this mean for home buyers and the average nonprofit housing developer? We've talked a bit about what larger private actors are doing in this space. Let's talk about what nonprofits are doing for a second. Acquisition, rehab, and sale strategies are the most common nonprofit activity in the single-family housing space. They often require significant subsidy. Habitat for Humanity and NeighborWorks affiliates are great examples of how this successful strategy can play out. They often contract smaller contractors to bring down costs, but we're still unaware of any successful program that doesn't require subsidy. Nonprofit managed property management portfolios are less common, and where they do exist, they're also heavily subsidized. Think LIHTC, housing vouchers, or their opportunistic approaches, think blight reduction programs. Some community land trusts have developed a rental portfolio alongside their homeownership portfolio to diversify revenue streams and allow them to take advantage of acquisition opportunities. Rent-to-own programs, though successful programs do exist, have found to be less successful or generally take a much longer time horizon than expected. And it's worth mentioning on this slide that public housing authorities often operate single-family rental and home portfolios and continuously transact, sell, and purchase those homes.
And it's also important to note that, part of the challenge here for nonprofits is that they have missions and they have obligations to the community that other owners do not. And that also adds a different component to the operation of property, the acquisition of property, pricing, and all that kind of stuff. And of course, single family or scattered site rentals is extraordinarily expensive and inefficient to manage, particularly if you're mission driven and you want to make sure that people stay in their homes.
One key area of overlap between the institutional investor and the nonprofit is often the target market. And this could be geographic, or in some senses we might say economic, or in some senses demographic. Per these graphs here, we're going to look at the left-hand side of each, and they show that in 2022, the percent of investor-owned single-family homes was highest in non-white, lower-income neighborhoods. These are the same neighborhoods where nonprofits and community development centers often focus their time. Majority community of color neighborhoods, living in homes that are low to mid price points that are set to appreciate or are currently appreciating, which means if they're not already being gentrified, they're at risk for gentrification. So if these communities of color are being pushed out of their neighborhoods at the exact moment when home values begin to appreciate, this only exacerbates the racial wealth gap that we are trying to solve.
And another point on these data, this is from the Twin Cities areas done by the the Federal Reserve of Minneapolis. And what they also found is that these entities don't stay or don't own a property indefinitely. They're in for the relatively short term, 5 to 7 years before they move on. But as Alex noted, they move on generally within the same demographics. They raise rents, in some ways up to market, but that does cause dislocation and residential instability, and that's really, really important for us as we're trying to get our arms around alternatives to this structure.
So over the next few slides, we're going to talk about strategies for nonprofits in the single-family housing space. We're familiar what private equity actors are doing. We're familiar with what nonprofits are doing, and now we know there is target market overlap. So let's talk about opportunities and how Grounded Solutions Network specifically is approaching these strategies.
So purchasing portfolios is strategy one. So we know that these kinds of transactions are driven between investors, right? And so one opportunity is to figure out when those are happening and when those are happening, and how we can get capital and nonprofits into that space, into those markets. That's extraordinarily important. So the timing is really important. It also has a target return and timeline, as I noted, that they expect to earn a certain amount of return, but they also expect to do this in a certain period of time. So it's also important for nonprofits and their policy partners and their community partners to be prepared to act when that timeline is running out. So we can have, constructive conversations with these institutional investors and help figure out where we're going to go next with the property transactions. That will help nonprofits across the country anticipate when the best transaction is possible at the best price for the nonprofit, and also in the best interest of the community. That is extraordinarily important. And you can see the chart here on the slide that it shows when these larger, that's the kind of the purple, the 1,000 plus homes were purchasing in the past decade or so. And you can see that they have really driven the market in recent years compared to other types of investors.
So on the tailwinds of Doug's explanation, I'm going to tell you all how exactly Grounded Solutions Network is leveraging an opportunity that he has just described. So in September of this year, just a couple of months ago, Grounded Solutions Network's new Homes for the Future Fund partnered with 5 other nonprofit and philanthropic organizations to purchase a single-family home portfolio of over 200 homes in the Minneapolis and St. Paul region. These homes are concentrated in historically low-income communities of color and also have the fastest appreciating home values in the region. This acquisition allowed the transfer of the portfolio from private, institutionally owned and controlled to nonprofit ownership and control. Homes for the Future contributed financially to this acquisition and were also co-asset managers of the portfolio. This allows us to have a hand in transitioning as many of these homes to affordable homeownership as possible. When these homes are transferred into homeownership, they will also be placed under the stewardship of Community Land Trust to ensure affordability and perpetuity, wealth building opportunities, and successful homeownership. If not for the preparedness and collaboration of this nonprofit buying group, this portfolio of homes could well have ended up back into the hands of another for-profit owner.
So leveraging institutional infrastructure. So this map just shows you, in one example, the concentration of these institutional investors, and you can see that by the size of the circle, how active they are in those rental markets. Research has supported the fact that they're most active in the southeastern part of the United States. You can see what markets: Atlanta, Charlotte, parts of Florida, Texas, and elsewhere, but also in the Southwest. I mentioned Las Vegas. They're also active in the Phoenix area. And there's a reason for that, but it's also where we would have to focus our expertise on in order to move the needle in favor of nonprofits, and frankly, often in the favor of communities. So the data can help support quick acquisition decisions. The data is always emerging. That's something we have to be on top of. We have to build out cost-efficient operations for our nonprofit partners. Not every housing nonprofit is going to be positioned to be able to do this, but we need to help build the capacity of our partners across the country. And they have to be efficient, as Alex mentioned earlier in the afternoon, about rehabs and operations. Often, in some cases, institutional investors do not invest enough money into the property. So at turnover, there's work to be done and to not only make it habitable, but make it really, if I may, a home for the future. That's extraordinarily important. And we have to have quality property management. Lots of nonprofits do a really good job, but this type of portfolio is a little different. And then finally, we have to be prepared for the disposition by the institutional investors when that time comes along.
That was a good pun, Doug. I caught that one. Yeah. I would like to tell you all how Grounded Solutions is leveraging this second strategy as well. Our first launch will be in Atlanta, ideally early next year. We're combining two proven housing models that have yet to be combined: single-family rental operations and shared equity housing. So we're all familiar with what single-family rental operations brings to the table, as Doug and I have been describing. Let me hit on some key highlights of shared equity housing. So we know that shared equity is an affordable housing model that balances the benefits of individual ownership and community benefit. Shared equity organizations also have a deep history of supporting Black and Brown communities, and they're experts in stewardship and property management. So here's how this strategy works in over 30 markets across the U.S. Homes for the Future will partner with our single-family rental operating partner to identify, acquire, rehab, and lease single-family rentals. Once those properties are occupied, Homes for the Future will purchase those properties from our operating partner and continue to leverage the operating partner's property management services. These homes will continue to be rented, and over the rental period, a few dynamics take place. Incomes increase over time, debt on each home is paid down, and the home values appreciate. This allows for, at a point in time, depending on the region and the market economics at the time, our models estimate between 6 to 10 years, the home can be sold to a home buyer at or below 80% of the area median income. Here is the secret sauce to all of this. The sale price of the home allows Homes for the Future to meet all of its financial obligations, generate a modest return, and make a home sale at an affordable price, all without the need for public subsidy. Said in another way, we're leveraging market economics and existing private infrastructure to create affordable home ownership opportunities without the need for public subsidy, which is very rare in our space. When these homes are sold, they will be sold to the qualified home buyer and also be placed into community land trust stewardship to ensure affordability in perpetuity, home ownership success, and wealth building opportunities. Here are some examples of our community land trust partners that I am blocking. Apologies. And I should mention that both of the strategies that Doug and I have discussed will be most successful if provided with low-cost, long-term funding, which there is a dearth of in the nonprofit space. As I mentioned, many private equity actors have access to bond financing and other forms of low-cost capital. These strategies will be most successful if our sector also has access to similar types of funding.
And strategy 3 is policy and policymaker support. So there's just a couple examples here, by no means exhaustive, but I want to just touch on a couple. Right here in Washington, D.C., there's a tenant opportunity to purchase program that has been in place since essentially 1980 when it was revised. I'll talk a little bit more about that in the future. There are not a lot of these across the country. I know you're aware of, we had the manufactured housing discussion earlier today about the opportunity to purchase manufactured housing communities. Similar rules here, but this is something that could really drive this market. Habitability and fair housing enforcement. For example, I think many of you might have seen that up in Minnesota, the Attorney General, Keith Ellison, had a settlement with institutional investors that enforces state law on habitability and fair housing, and also required the sale of some of these properties from their portfolio. And why is that important? Because states and localities across the country have this power to enforce habitability standards, quality housing, safety, all sorts of things, as well as civil rights provisions. And they should use that as part of their toolbox. And if an owner is not complying with the law, in some places, like in Cincinnati, there's a recent ordinance from the end of last year that allows the Department of Buildings director to pursue foreclosure if everything else has failed. And what's interesting about Cincinnati, I do not believe that any units have been foreclosed in this manner, but the Port of Cincinnati has acquired a portfolio of housing in the same manner that we're talking about. So guess what? There's opportunities to do this, and this also, frankly, puts bad actors on notice that you can't degrade housing and communities for profit. If you're going to own the property, you have to comply with the law. And then finally, another example, which is hopefully will get some traction across the country and at the federal level, are tax incentives. The state of Montana has a capital gains exclusion for the sale of manufactured housing and mobile home communities to nonprofits, government instrumentality, or to cooperatives. And that has actually triggered quite a few transactions in the state of Montana. Just an interesting example. So we'll talk about a couple of these real quick. In Washington, just as one example, about 16,000 units have been developed or preserved because of TOPA. Residents can assume the rights, meaning that they can purchase the property themselves, or they can assign the rights to a nonprofit to act on their behalf. That's a really good model. You need to have both options, depending on the capacity of the community. It reduced productivity in recent years. The peak was about a decade ago. So the city has to make some changes and figure out why that's happening. And frankly, a lot of it has to do with technical assistance, legal help, and basically capital, as Alex mentioned. They need access to low-cost capital. It's not going to work. This is an extraordinarily high-cost housing market, as everybody here knows. And then finally, DC has to improve outreach. They got to let folks know that this is an option. So what's next? Resources. We're not going to talk about the election, except we're going to talk about the election, because what did happen is that a lot of ballot initiatives actually were adopted by the voters across the country. That's good news for the housing sector. From bonds to other things across the country in cities and states. For example, Los Angeles and Rhode Island passed some really meaningful resource bonds. And then a couple cities in North Carolina, Chapel Hill and Charlotte, among others, have also done something similar. But practitioners in those communities, along with their national partners, have to weigh in on the rules. What kind of housing is targeted? How is this money going to go out? Who can participate? What kind of lasting affordability is going to be built in? What are the deed restrictions going to be? And that can come out of the NOFAs to support these emerging opportunities. This is now a good time. We haven't really had this much success at the ballot box in the housing sector in many, many years. So this is really something to come. And then finally, we have to rethink in how we access mission-aligned capital. We talked about CDFI, state housing finance agencies, the GSEs, loan pools. There's lots of resources out there. But to a point that Alex made earlier, it's often inefficient to cobble all these things together to make a deal pencil out. And that is extraordinarily difficult to do. We have to be much more efficient about that. And that's it. So thank you. We want to take some questions from the audience. We have one from the virtual audience, but does anybody out in the real world here want to ask something?
Struck by genius ideas, you know.
Or just want to leave?
Yeah.
But we do have one, so I can ask this question. Isn't part of the private equity advantage the use of monopoly power and collusion on rents? So that's a question that, I don't know if you want to take a stab at that. I can too.
Do you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, I think that's a loaded question. I mean, collusion is an extraordinarily difficult thing to prove. And I do think you can argue that their institutional investors are competing with each other depending on the market and the housing type. But I do think, as I touched on earlier, is that laws have to be enforced. If there is collusion, that has to be drawn out. And also on rents, that would be against the law. That would be against federal law and many state laws, I would assume. So that also has to be enforced. I am not aware of any research that supports that this is an overarching challenge that we're facing because of private equity. I do think what's driving private equity is the cost of housing, the amount of capital that they have, and the cost of home financing for the prospective home buyer.
I would add too that this model isn't assuming that we become private equity actors.
No.
We're focused on leveraging the very specific tools that many private actors use to bring down their costs, to make models more efficient and more successful. And we do have different goals in the end. So right, maybe there is some economics that would drive profits through the roof to meet target returns at a certain timeline. We're focused on mission and making homes affordable with little to no public subsidy. So our goals look much different than theirs.
Yeah, and absolutely. Remember, one of our goals is to make stable communities and wealth-building opportunities for families across the country, particularly communities of color. And that is our mission, and that's why we're in this. But that also means improving the quality of the housing stock, reducing barriers to entry for home ownership, and again, lasting affordability, because that is the key to making this work for this generation and the next generation. We're really at a pivotal moment with the cost of housing and the cost of mortgages right now. But since the Great Recession, we've lost like a generation and a half of potential new homeowners, and that is something that we can't let happen again. Please.
Is there a need for more property managers to participate in your program?
That's a great question. So our operating partner, property managers, Amherst, that was the map you all saw on the screen of their locations. I would say for nonprofit standards, there are probably much fewer property managers that exist generally, right? We went through a very thorough vetting process and found a high quality partner that met our standards about how we wanted to see properties maintained, tenants treated, et cetera, et cetera. I would say there's definitely a need, this approach needs more resources put towards it generally. Property managers, in order for this to be successful, would need to be quite large, right? You saw Amherst's map was multi-state, multi-regional. So it would be great if there were more partners. We're a paying client of our partner. There's no nonprofit discount or anything like that. So we are looking for other partners, and we hope to see other organizations making similar partnerships with their regional property managers.
A similar question from the audience is, and Alex, maybe you can take this. How are you going about identifying institutional investors and nonprofit partners?
Institutional investors and nonprofit partners. I'll start with the nonprofit partners, which I believe maybe refers to the local community land trust that we're working with. So Grounded Solutions Network is first and foremost a membership organization of over 250 members across the U.S., more than half of which are community land trusts. We're very familiar with our members and their models, have been working in this for decades. And so that's how we are identifying our local nonprofit partners. If they're not our members, they're probably closely tied to our network in some way. And then in terms of the institutional investors, probably reframing that into an operating partner is how we're partnering with these larger players. And probably going back to what I just mentioned as far as a heavy vetting process to make sure they meet our standards of what we'd want to see in a partner.
And with that, we're done. Thank you very much.
Nice.